Hey guys, welcome to the Cybersecurity and Infotech book review series with Fix Secure Security. And hope you all had an amazing week so far and everything went so well. So it's been quite some time since we had this book review series. And the previous session we are supposed to have, we had a glitch that has to do with Microsoft and their Windows patch and updates, which impacted a few of our systems, which we used to do our work. Okay. So during the patch fix and so on, we were preoccupied with a lot of projects, and the video recording that session was quite crappy that we couldn't, make this publication then on the book review YouTube channel. So we believe that made us to skip that week, and it was quite disappointing because we never had the intention to do so. And as promised, we said we're going to post the video then during the week. But unfortunately, we also didn't meet up with the promises because we were still preoccupied running the patch. So for those who are familiar with Windows operating system, they have recently released the 25H2 version of Windows 11. And a lot of people have been complaining about issues on running the patch, especially on enterprise systems and so on. Okay. This has to do with licensing and other features I cannot say because it's not related to this topic. But basically it was resolved, and we're able to resolve that issue, and we're back and for a good cause. Okay, so let's cut out the long story and move on to the topic for today and discuss a few books which we have, made for this week. So for this week, to compensate for the lapses we had, this was a book we wanted to review on the last episode, which we did. But we decided to make another video to integrate this month's book review series. Okay. So today we'll be presenting two books, and this is the first book for the week and for the month of November. So the book for today, it's known as Mobile Device Management or Modern Device Management Fundamental Security and the Modern Desktop using Intune, Autopilot, and Azure to manage, deploy, and secure Windows 10. Okay. This book was written by Jeremy Moskowitz or Moskowitz. I don't know how to pronounce that, but basically, Jeremy did an amazing job. And from my experience in this book that I read, I can tell you that whatever it's in this book is still applicable to the Windows 11 environment. Okay, when it comes to Intune, Autopilot, and of course, Entra, known as Azure, right? So how to manage mobile devices. It's all well detailed in this book with a screenshot. Okay. So it's a comprehensive book that describes in details on the fundamentals of modern device management or mobile device management. Sorry for that spelling there. And also talks about the EWM, which is the Enterprise Mobility Management, and MDM solutions. So when we talk about MDM solutions, we are talking about organizations having their custom applications, okay, and managing licensing on this custom app store, okay. So as you know, most applications by Microsoft are either free or paid licensed. And for those paid licensed means if individuals want to buy them, they have to either provide a credit card or any other sensitive information that, has to do the debiting for them to get the license key. So MDM Solutions has an integration of company portal, if you're very familiar with the DSS role or IT support role. So this is where organizations deploy or manage application licensing. Okay. So they use this to manage their infrastructure. And if you work for big organizations, or let's say Fortune 500s, you can notice that when you try to access Microsoft Store, this application has been disabled because the organization manages its own enterprise software via company portal. Okay, so this way they can also manage the licensing as well. So let's say a user requests on an application and it requires the user to get, to pay for that. They have a separate form. They will have to raise the request. The organization team that is responsible for managing those applications will receive the request, get the licensing, and deploy on the back end. So this user, based on the cloud environment, will be able to receive this application, pushed to their own part of the company portal. Okay, so this book talks about this. Not really like, let's say 100% if you want to go full-time application management when it comes to Copilot. But whatever information you find in this book is very superb and amazing when it comes to MDM solutions. Also, emphasizing on Windows 10 Enterprise Management Solution for IT support roles, which are very attuned to those in the L2 support roles and L3 support roles. Okay, so these are like the back-end team, which is the classification for them. They are very focused on the technical aspect of IT support roles, unlike the L1 support roles, which are like the front desk or the IT help desk or desk side support L1. Okay, so the L2 and L3 deal with the technical aspect of managing mobile devices on Windows 10 Enterprise solutions. So if you are into that category of support teams as an IT professional or system administrator, then this book is specifically designed for you to get the basic or the foundation of modern device management or mobile device management. So on the third concept is that these are core concepts that can be replicated on Windows 11 environments and enterprise solution. So if you're very familiar with Windows environments, you will be aware that Windows 10 has gradually been phased out on enterprise scale, except those who are still paying special licensing, where they have to have the Windows 10 LTSC, okay, for management. So whatever you see in this book, take it from an IT professional who has interacted with Intune, Autopilot. Everything still remains in the Windows 11 environment. The only difference is that more features has been implemented, or when it comes to Intune and Entra and other GUIs in terms of the graphical user interface that has more configurations and settings. Okay. On the fourth point is that the book has a knowledge on GPOs, which is the group policies management, AD, which is Active Directory, and how to manage these policies, Azure, currently known as Entra ID, and of course, Intune integration with modern device management or mobile device management. So if you really want to know how these are synced into one nature, let's use the word nature, and ensure that MDM, which is the modern device, are properly managed, then I tell you this book is a foundational book that you should have. Okay, nothing beats the information in this book as much as the proper explanation, with the intention that the user who is using this book has no knowledge on modern device management and they want to know what it's all about. So if you are in that category of persons or people, then I suggest you get this book. On the last point is that this book explains on why and how organizations use company portal to manage their apps instead of Microsoft Store instead of Microsoft Store on enterprise level. So like we previously said, is that these provide a special application known as company portal. You're going to learn how to use PowerShell scripts to deploy organizations' applications, customize these, and of course, that includes licensed applications. Okay, so these licensed applications that you need to pay for. You don't want to employ, let's say you're managing 10,000 employees, for example, or let's say you're managing 1 million employees, and you want them to just be buying softwares, incurring fees, on the organization's resources. Okay, maybe these softwares, they buy them, they are not going to use them. Okay, or they just buy the license and just leave it there. So this is like some sort of economic wastage. So company portal is a way of how these are managed. So whatever application you want, if you search it, you don't have it, you have to raise a special request to the application team and say you want these applications. And they would have to look into your job scope if you actually really need this. And if you actually do, they can now procure the license on the back end, push this application specially for you. Okay, since everything has to do with the cloud, you are the only person that is going to be seeing this on your own company portal, not other employees of the organizations that have not requested for this license. Okay. So on the 3 key points that makes this book unique is that it has a lot of illustrations and PowerShell commands with images with a very detailed explanation. So everything that was explained in this book has image illustrations. You can see what the author is trying to say and of course what it's all about. On the second key point is that it has a structural concept of every fundamentals with a detailed note centered on description. So the author of this book put in a lot of work to explain everything. It's not like he just put an image and just say run this command, execute this command. Everything was properly explained. So whatever you see in this book would not only be a knowledge, but a proper insight on what is done or what you need to do when provisioning security on modern desktop using MDM solutions. And lastly, the third key point that makes this book unique is that it's a book well recommended for every IT, DSS, system admin, L2 and L3. So if you're in these IT support roles and you deal with a lot of technical stuff, then please get this book as a manual you can be referencing to, even though there are a lot of changes in Windows 11 and of course when it comes to Entra ID, but these changes were like additional features. It doesn't scrap out the previous features that was implemented on Azure, which is now known as Entra. So Intune management is still the same, autopilot is still in use, and other concept when it comes to the Windows operating system. So this book goes for $41, and our rating score in terms of IT general rating score, this is recommended to be a 5.0 because not only for IT support roles, even though you're a cybersecurity professional and you decide one day you want to have your little organization, you should have an insight of how things are done to manage mobile devices in your organization. Okay, so you can get a book of this nature and of course use it to study and read, even though if you're not going to be actively in that role, but you can always know, when your IT support personnel tries to explain certain things to you, and of course know how especially licensing of applications are done using company portal and PowerShell script. Now for IT support role, we will give this book a 4.5. Okay. The reason why we cannot give it more than this is that IT support role doesn't just deal with MDM. You have to learn about GPOs, you have to learn about Active Directory and so on. So this book doesn't touch that aspect of the profession. So we cannot just give it a 5.0, because if you have to give a book of that rating, then you should be ensuring that it covers everything that has to do with IT support role, but it doesn't. Okay. But whatever that is in this book is sufficient enough for anyone who wants to get into IT support role or system administrator, L2 and L3 support. Okay. So get this book and ensure you take your time and study, not read. Study this book. You will learn a lot of things from it. On the second book for this week, we are going to be talking about a well-known book known as Grep Pocket Reference. This book was written by John Bamberneck and Agnieszka Klaus. So John Bamberneck is a very popular guy. I think he has a podcast in cybersecurity. I've forgotten the podcast channel, but I do listen to his podcast, in the past months and for the past 2 or 3 years. Just that of recent, I've not been able to listen to it because I've been busy quite a lot. But John Bambenek did an amazing job here. I wouldn't speak much about this book. Just get it because it's something very straightforward. Okay. You're going to learn how to use grep quotations and regular expressions. You're going to learn how to use grep in searching meta characters, especially for bug bounty hunters. If you really want to learn or have basic knowledge summarized in a 78 or 79 page book on egrep and grep, then this book is for you. Okay. You're also going to learn how to use POSIX character classes with regular expressions. Okay. And further understand how to craft and use basic and regular expressions. So these are very essential because when you're trying to hunt for bugs, you come across JS files and so on, or some special files, and you want to, search, these files that has millions of JavaScript codes, then you should get this book. This book is well documented in summary on how to use various concepts, when it comes to grep. You're also going to learn how to match, general output controls, and of course, learn how to use extended regular expression, which is known as the egrep, and of course, the fgrep, which is the fast grep. Then most importantly, this book talks about PCRE for robust searching, auto searching, and character properties. So it's not like this book was written as a story. It was basically written as a manual for those who are interested, to learn how to use grep to filter sensitive informations and get whatever they want when they come across files that have thousands or even millions of JavaScript codes. Okay. So grep is not only used in searching sensitive information in JavaScript files. You can also use it in Linux environment, to search for, files as well, especially if you're into red teaming. Okay, and you're pawning a machine, and this machine is a Linux-based environment, then this book is for you. Okay, get a copy and of course use it, by understanding the concept of everything that was explained in the book. Okay, so the three key points that makes this book unique is that the description in this book makes it suitable for anyone who is interested or uses the Linux flavors. So it doesn't matter if you're using Kali or Ubuntu or Fedora. Learning grep and regex patterns are very essential. Okay, it makes your work faster, and of course, locating things in terms of sensitive informations on JavaScript files, or let's say huge files that has to do with information and data. Okay, when you come across them and you want to filter specific informations to locate those information, then you should get this book. The second key point is that it has a good summary for every red team professionals, and they should have this as a field manual. So like we said, if you're into pen testing, red teaming, and you want a book that quickly summarizes grep, egrep, and fast grep, then this book is for you. Okay, get a copy, study about it, learn about it, and trust me, you're going to have a good time understanding the concept in this book. And the third key point is that it's perfect for searching sensitive information, and of course, a recommended book for every bug bounty hunter. So if you're into bug bounty hunting, then I tell you, just get this book. It's going to be of great help for you. Not because you're going to read it as a book, but you can always reference to it as a manual to find whatever informations when you're trying to use the grep commands in searching sensitive data on a JavaScript file or whatever files you come across. Okay, so the general cybersecurity score for this book is a 5.0 because it talks a lot on cybersecurity related stuff. But for red teaming, we are going to give it a 4.7. Okay. So this is due to that this book is only for beginners to intermediate, users for grep commands, not like professional level, because there are books that talks on grep more advanced. Okay. And we believe we have said something about such books. Yeah. So get this book. It is very essential that you have this book. Use it and learn whatever you need to learn. And it just goes for $15 on Amazon. Okay. Not too expensive, but a bit expensive for those who cannot afford. But if you can, then get a copy of this book. Okay. So that sums it up for this week book review series. And later during the week or before next weekend, we will put this officially on our website in the bookstore section. For the Amazon link, we'll share it when we have the time. But if you want to buy, you can head on to Amazon because we don't have the link right now. Just get a copy, study, and if you have any difficulties, then you can reach out to us to explain a bit section of the books which we have reviewed this week, and we will be able to support or explain via our Discord channel. Of course, that comes as a special privilege for those who are on Discord. Okay. So thank you for watching and see you next week for cybersecurity training with Fixing Gateway Security, and bye for now.